'cause you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Or when you can't, you won't, and you don't stop. Mike D coming down for sure, shine.
So last time in the video series, what we were looking at was whether we owed a duty of care. What we need to do now is go on with the next steps, which is understanding whether that duty of care has been breached and whether that breach actually led or caused the harm. Because without those three elements, you'll remember, we don't have negligence. We're also going to have a look at some of the defences that are actually available. You'll remember that in the last module, when we're looking at owing a duty of care, we were primarily looking at case law, because whether you owe a duty is still contained in case law or common law sense too. However, the area of negligence has been reformed, and we went over that reform process very early on in the last module. And as a result of that, steps 2 and 3 have actually been embedded in legislation, in the Civil Liability Act, or the CLA. So this time, in this module, we'll be concentrating on some statutory elements of negligence that are necessary to show. So why don't we hop in? So what we've done is we've already looked at what a tort is, and specifically we've looked at what the tort of negligence is. And we've also ticked off this requirement about whether we owe a duty of care. So now we're going to look at these next two requirements, the breach of that duty of care along with causation, and then we're going to introduce you to some of the defences. The defences are actually a very complex area, so we more introduce the ideas to you, introduce the concepts rather than going in detail as to what they actually are. So I know you're going to get sick of hearing me saying it, but we need three things when we are going to show negligence. The first is we've got to owe a duty of care. The second is we've got to breach the duty of care. And the third then is that breach must actually cause the harm. And that's the only way we can do the full test. After we've found whether someone is negligent, legally speaking, we then need to look at whether there are any defences available, particularly voluntary assumption of risk and also contributory negligence. So let's have a look at breach of duty of care. So the example that we have here is a very simple one. We know that if we're a motorist, we owe. The example that we have here is a very simple one. We know that it's an established category that if we're a motorist, we owe other road users a duty of care. So imagine we're in our car driving along and someone hits us from behind out of nowhere. Are we negligent? Well, in order for us to be negligent, we also have to have breached that duty of care. So we owed a duty of care to the person who hit us, right? But the question is, did we breach that duty of care, right? So owing a duty is not the same as negligence, because we must have done something or failed to do something that led to the actual harm, right? And so on first instances in this example, you'd kind of be saying, no, if we're just driving along or we're sitting at the lights and we get hit, we haven't done anything that would breach that duty of care. Now, there may be some circumstances you can think of where we would have. Maybe we don't have our lights on and it's at night, etc. So you can always come up with a circumstance where it's possible. That's why you have to look at the facts of each particular situation when we're answering this question. But that's what breach of duty of care is about. Did you do something or should you have done something that you didn't do? Okay, that's what we're looking at in this breach of duty of care. So the breach of duty of care is contained under Section 9 of the Civil Liability Act. So let's have a look at that. There are three things that we need to actually have if we're going to establish someone breached their duty of care. And you'll notice that this is an AND test. So we need to have all three elements here, okay? So the risk must have been foreseeable. Okay, now we're changing foreseeability. You remember I went into great detail that in the last module. So now we've got to say that the risk is foreseeable, okay? The risk was not insignificant. That's really interesting, not insignificant. It doesn't mean it needs to be a significant risk. It just needs to be not insignificant. And then finally, in the circumstances a reasonable person in the position of the person with the duty of care would have taken precautions. Now, this reasonable person is what we call an objective test, okay? It's not whether the person thought they should have taken precautions. That would be a subjective test. Here it's an objective test. Would a reasonable person have taken precautions? So Section 9.1 sets out these three elements, but let's have a look at those three elements in a little bit more detail because they're a little bit complicated than what they might first seem. So the first thing we need to understand is whether the risk is foreseeable. Okay. Notice there's no use of the word reasonable here. Okay. And so what we're trying to understand is whether it was foreseeable that the actual act of carelessness, like the omission or the act, would cause harm. The plaintiff, the person supposedly who's done this act, should know or ought to have known of that risk. On the right, we've got an example of the second element, which is that this risk must not be insignificant. So what does that mean? Think of it the other way of what it's not. So if a risk is insignificant, then you don't breach your duty of care, even if you don't do anything. Okay? So it's more understanding whether the risk was insignificant. What's an example of an insignificant risk? Okay, there's a great example from cricket where a cricket ball gets hit out of a stadium, over a stand, out of a stadium and hits and injures someone. But evidence showed that a ball had been hit out of the stadium only once in the past 30 years. Okay, so the chances of a ball leaving the stadium was 1 in 30 years. That was an insignificant risk. Okay, so that's the example is one incident in 30 years of a ball outside the stadium. That was an insignificant risk. Okay, so you've got to ask yourself, is this risk insignificant? Okay. So they're the first two elements. Was that risk foreseeable? Was the risk not insignificant?